over the bill. 2 years ago, Major League Baseball moved the All-Star Game out of Atlanta on the Democrats' false narrative. This hurt workers who are relying on the game for their income. Fast forward. Not only did the Atlanta Braves go on to win the World Series, but under the new, as a Brewers fan, that kind of hurts my heart. But it is true. It is true. The Atlanta Braves would go on to win the World Series. But under the Georgia election law, Georgia hit a new record with the highest voter turnout in midterm history. I'll now play a 2-minute video. Hear for yourself the left's false claims on election integrity being debunked.
SB 202 reforms to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat.
It proved immediately polarizing.
Well, first of all, I do absolutely agree that it's racist. It is a redux of Jim Crow in a suit and tie.
21st century Jim Crow assault is real.
Organizations like the PGA, the MLB are also under pressure to move high-profile events like the Masters and the All-Star Game out of your state of Georgia. Should boycotts be on the table?
I think we all have to use our voices.
So, Mr. President, what do you think about the possibility that baseball decides to move their All-Star Game out of Atlanta because of this political issue?
I think today's professional athletes are acting incredibly responsibly. I would strongly support them doing that.
Major League Baseball announcing it's moving this season's All-Star Game and MLB draft out of Atlanta, Georgia. The reason is the state's new law on voting.
Major League Baseball for pulling the All-Star Game out of Atlanta, a move one local official says could cost upwards of $100 million in lost revenue.
It obviously had an economic impact. Thousands of average Georgians who were relying on that as an economic opportunity lost out.
Turnout in Georgia now breaking records. More than 250,000 people have voted in person just since Monday.
Over 500,000 votes now cast in the Peach State. It's historic record voter turnout.
And the big argument from the White House was that it would suppress voting. But there was record turnout in the primary, there was record turnout in the general.
And then the empirical data came forward and actually showed that by putting in place strong voter integrity provisions, what we actually got was higher participation. So tomorrow is the 2023 Major League Baseball All-Star Game. We're here at Turner Field, former home of the Atlanta Braves and now Georgia State University's Center Park Stadium. I'm proud to share that today we're officially introducing the American Confidence in Elections Act. The ACE Act is our federalist approach to boost voter confidence and encourage more states to implement common sense election integrity reforms. We've held several hearings leading up to today's introduction, focusing on the 3 main pillars of the bill. The ACE Act will provide states with the tools to implement election integrity reforms, implement key election integrity reforms in Washington, D.C. in particular, and protect political speech. I know the left is going to be attacking the bill just like they did in Georgia. But here's the truth about the ACE Act. The ACE Act will uphold the Constitution and ensure states maintain primary control over elections. The ACE Act will support our overseas military voters. The ACE Act will give states access to federal databases like the Social Security death list so they can remove dead people from their active voter rolls. The ACE Act will prevent federal funds from flowing to places that allow non-citizens to vote. The ACE Act will stop foreign adversaries from voting in D.C. elections. The ACE Act will permanently prohibit bureaucrats of the IRS from targeting conservative nonprofit groups. The ACE Act will fight against cancel culture and protect Americans' First Amendment rights. The ACE Act will stop the Biden administration from weaponizing federal agencies, and it will prevent federal dollars from being used for partisan election activities. Most importantly, the ACE Act will restore voter confidence in our elections. When voters are more confident their vote will count, they're more likely to participate. Fighting for election integrity is important, and we're prepared to win. The ACE Act is House Republicans' key election integrity bill, and I look forward to seeing it pass on the House floor later this year. Thank you. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Morelli, for 5 minutes for the purposes of making opening remarks.
Good afternoon, and thank you, first of all, to the people of Georgia for hosting us, and to Chairman Stile for welcoming us today. We meet for what is the 9th elections-related hearing this committee has held in just this Congress in a little over 6 months. Once again, we'll discuss conspiracy theories about hypothetical election insecurity, and the majority will push their now familiar anti-voter agenda. The only difference now is that we've taken the circus on the road. One might ask, why are we here in Georgia? The answer is simple. We're here because in 2020, Joe Biden won and Donald Trump lost. There was no widespread voter fraud in Georgia. There were no suitcases full of fake ballots. No voting machines changed any votes. In fact, we only know of one possible crime that took place because it was recorded on tape. Please play the video.
All I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
Donald Trump didn't win Georgia, of course. The results confirm that. A Trump-requested recount confirmed that. A statewide audit confirmed that. Multiple investigations have confirmed that. But instead of condemning this blatant attempt to steal an election, the Georgia legislature responded to the former president's lies by proposing and passing SB 202 in early 2021. SB 202 affected almost every method of voting in Georgia. For example, SB 202 dramatically limited the number of drop boxes voters can use, especially in significantly black communities, to return their ballots. The law banned individuals and groups from giving out water or food to voters waiting in line, sometimes for hours in the hot Georgia sun, to vote. Mr. Chairman. SB 202 also allows any voter to challenge the eligibility of any other voter, with no limit on the number of challenges allowed. One man alone in Forsyth County had challenged the eligibility of over 13,000 valid voters. Dr. Kathleen Ruth, a GOP-appointed member of Fulton County's Elections Board and a witness here today, herself received a voter challenge because of SB 202. These indiscriminate challenges do not just threaten Georgians' access to the ballot, they overwhelm election administrators who must respond to tens of thousands of unwarranted challenges within a handful of days. It's important that our voter rolls are accurate and up to date, but it should be the role of elections administrators to ensure proper election administration, not some local election denying conspiracy theorist who's been fooled by the former president and his enablers. Letting vigilantes subject their neighbors based on no evidence to state-enforced inquisitions in the name of election integrity is a nightmare out of an Orwellian novel. Unfortunately, this doublespeak is in line with modern Republican orthodoxy. SB 202's provisions simultaneously limit voter access while overburdening election administration. An overburdened election administration, in turn, further jeopardizes voter access. The big lie origins of SB 202 mirror the big lie origins of the majority's ACE Act, and the damaging effects of SB 202 on Georgia voters will be imposed upon all Americans if the ACE Act is enacted nationally. I have to give my majority colleagues credit, if nothing else, for their boldness. Most thieves come in the middle of the night, but here we are in broad daylight. We're at the scene of the crime. We are holding a hearing in Georgia where President Trump, in his now infamous and corrupt call to Secretary Raffensperger, tried to irrevocably damage the integrity of American elections. If our majority truly cared about restoring confidence in our elections, perhaps we would finally confront their twice-indicted leader for his own behavior. But I won't hold my breath. We should do better. We must do better. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Without objection, all members' opening statements will be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Pursuant to paragraph B of Committee Rule 6, the witnesses will please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative and may be seated. I'll now introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Kathleen Ruth, who was the Vice Chair of the Fulton County Board of Registration and Elections from 2019 to 2023 and currently serves as the Director of Program Development at CAI Global. Dr. Ruth, it's always great to have a fellow Wisconsin Badger with us, even when in Atlanta, Georgia. Our next witness, Mr. Hans von Spakovsky, is a Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Foundation Center for Legal and Judicial Studies and has also served on the Fulton County Registration and Elections Board. As a manager of the think tank's Election Law Reform Initiative, Mr. von Spakovsky is a leader on studying voter fraud and voter ID, enforcement of federal voting rights laws, administration of elections, and voting equipment standards. Our next witness, Vernetta Keith Neurodyne, was appointed to serve on the Fulton County Board of Registration and Elections as Vice Chair, overseeing all elections in Fulton County from 2017 to 2021. Ms. Neurodyne is certified by the Election Secretary of State as a Georgia elections official, a Georgia registrar, and a municipal elections official. And finally, Kathy Willard has served as the Chair of Fulton County Board of Registration and Elections since September 2021. As a reminder, we've read your written statements and it will appear in full in the hearing record. Under Committee Rule 9, you're to limit your oral presentation to a brief summary of your written statement unless I extend the time period in consultation with Ranking Member Morelli. Please remember to press the button on the microphone in front of you so that it is on and members can hear you. When you begin to speak, the light in front of you will turn green, and after 4 minutes it will turn yellow. When the red light comes up, your 5 minutes have expired, and I would ask you to please wrap up. I'll now recognize Dr. Kathleen Ruth for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the Committee on House Administration for this invitation. I value public service and was honored to serve 2 terms as a member of the Fulton County Board of Registrations and Elections from 2019 to 2023. Fulton County is the largest county in the state of Georgia. It has a population roughly the size of 8 states. It covers 70 miles from end to end across 15 cities, including the city of Atlanta. Fulton has approximately 765,000 voters. I say all this to highlight the complexities encountered in managing efficient elections. The 2020 election presented unique and elevated challenges to the county's well-documented history of issues administering elections. The election was managed through a global pandemic. Lawmakers responded by introducing new processes designed to make voting accessible during the public health crisis, including expanding absentee by mail, introducing drop boxes, and extending in-person voting. All of this was on top of the implementation of new voting machines. Additionally, Fulton County was at the center of growing change in the political climate, beginning in 2016, elevating in 2018, and peaking in 2020. Each of these factors exacerbated the unique complexities of managing elections in Fulton County, while also highlighting the vulnerabilities and underlying problems that have existed in elections for years across the country. Fast forwarding to 2023, the Fulton County Board of Registration and Elections worked with internal partners to examine lessons learned and develop recommendations from 2020 to make improvements. The department also received reports based on hundreds of hours of observation documented from Carter Jones, an election strategist, and the Carter Center to make further adjustments to increase election administration performance. Lastly, House Bill 202 helped to improve the processing of absentee applications and absentee by mail ballots to ensure more timely verification. The Fulton County BRE, under new leadership, increased staff, guidance from an engaged Board of Registration and Elections, were able to incorporate recommendations and make significant improvements to modernize elections develop standard operating procedures for every function of elections, provide more contextualized poll worker training, and maintain compliance with the State Board of Election. For Fulton to uphold the mission to ensure that the registration and elections process is efficient and effectively provided to all eligible citizens, state officials will need to continuously provide tools to modernize elections and remove outdated and burdensome policies. American voters expect voting officials to ensure that every eligible citizen can vote and make sure that their vote is not weakened due to errors, inconsistencies, and inefficient systems. I'm honored to participate in today's hearing and hope that my experience and observations can be used to support the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ruth. Mr. Hans von Spakovsky, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the invitation to be here today. As I was coming down here, I was reminded of the fact that many members of the committee probably know I've testified in front of congressional hearings numerous times, but the first time I ever did that was more than 2 decades ago at a field hearing in Atlanta after the 2000 election, when Congress was trying to determine what kind of reforms should be put in to try to prevent the kind of problems we saw in Florida from happening again. And that led to the passage of the Help America Vote Act, a bipartisan effort. I really regret the fact that there is this bipartisan divide has developed since then, because that didn't exist in 2002 when Congress did things in the Help America Vote Act, like pass the first, although limited, voter ID requirement for federal elections. We need both access and security in our election process, and contrary to what many critics say, one does not cancel out the other. The kind of common sense reforms as Georgia passed are prime examples of providing both access and security. Congress has to keep in mind that states have had the primary role in administering our elections. That's what the Constitution says since our founding, under the ultimate supervision of Congress and under the protections of the Constitution and federal laws passed pursuant to it, like the Voting Rights Act. The role of federal government should be to assist and help the states in their administration of elections, not imposing unjustified, unconstitutional, and impractical mandates on them, which is what H.R. 1, the For the People Act, would have done, including things like banning all voter ID laws in the country, a requirement that's overwhelmingly supported by Americans, no matter their race or political background. This bill does good things like mandate access for the states to federal databases, such as the Department of Homeland Security's alien database. You have to be a citizen to vote in federal elections. You have to be a citizen to vote in all state elections in all states. The exception is some states allow that in local elections. But clearly, that's relevant to your eligibility, and yet the Department of Homeland Security for years, through bureaucracy and red tape, has made it so difficult for states to get that information that most state election officials will tell you they've given up trying to do it. Another clear source of information, and I don't know why anyone would be against this, is federal courts call people for jury duty, and I'm sure most of the people in this room have been called for jury duty. They get their jury lists from state election officials. When someone is excused from jury duty in a federal court, and remember, they have to answer questions under oath, because they say, I am not a U.S. citizen, that information needs to be sent back to state election officials, yet today it is not. And the amendment in this bill to the NVRA that would require that is a good thing. So is the amendment that's proposed in this bill to the Real ID Act. Again, the major form of ID used in this country, because we don't have a national ID card, are state driver's licenses. Obviously, those driver's licenses should state on their face whether you are a U.S. citizen or not. And that would be useful not only in the voting context, but also in many others, such as applications for federal welfare benefits, which in most cases require you to be a U.S. citizen. one of the most, look, many parts of this bill deal with election administrations and providing assistance to the states. But I got to tell you, one of the most important provisions in here is Title VI, which would terminate all federal dollars for and end the disinformation board set up by DHS, which is this administration's version of an Orwellian ministry of truth. I cannot believe that the federal government has been engaging in censoring Americans' viewpoints and opinions. That was something my parents thought we had left behind when my German mother, who grew up in Nazi Germany, immigrated to this country with my Russian father. And yet we've had it going on here. The federal government has no business determining what is the truth or engaging in any actions that censor information, opinions, and viewpoints of American citizens. I can talk a lot about how turnout in Georgia not only was above the national average turnout in 2022, but was higher than the turnout of the three home states of the biggest critics. The turnout in Georgia was higher than Delaware, New York, and California, and yet the state has been criticized. Let me end with this. I want to ensure that every eligible American is able to vote, that their votes are not diluted because of fraud, errors, mistakes made by election officials. I think the ACE Act will do that by helping the states and not telling them what to do in often what could be a bad way. And those changes to protect First Amendment rights are vitally important, because being able to speak politically in the election area is vital to maintaining our democracy.
Thank you very much, Mr. von Spakovsky. Ms. Neurodyne, you're now recognized for 5 minutes. Just double check your mic, if you would.
First, I want to thank you, Chairman Stile, and the esteemed members of the Committee on House Administration for the invitation to speak today. It's through these efforts that we can strengthen our republic and ensure that every voice is heard. As I am Vernetta Keith Neurodyne, a native of Atlanta. As you heard from Chairman Stile, I served on the Fulton County Board of Registration and Elections from March of 2017 until June of 2021. During the 2018 midterm elections and the 2020 presidential elections, as well as through the enactment of House Bill 316 and Senate Bill 202. Before I talk about Senate Bill 202, I want to step back a moment and talk about HB 316. In 2019, HB 316 established the Dominion voting equipment as the uniform state equipment for Georgia. Like in 2002, as Mr. Spakovsky referenced, when the state legislature approved the usage of the Debo voting machines for the midterm election, like that, HB 316 was criticized for its cost and the corruptibility of the equipment. I bring up the voting machines past and present because both were a direct response to the public. One following the 2000 presidential election and the other following the 2018 midterm elections. In 2000, there was a public outcry to reduce the time it took to tabulate elections after Al Gore's defeat following the Florida recount. Parenthetically, I believe that HB 316 too was a direct response to the need to update Georgia's antiquated voting system, but mainly to provide a paper audit of Georgia's elections results after the 2018 elections. The paper audit requirement was due largely in part to civic leaders and organizations advocating for paper ballots. I maintain the concerns of cost and corruptibility of the voting machines are valid and should be mitigated. Having said that, I'm not sure if any voting machine can be designed nor created that would not have major opposition. Following the devastation caused by COVID-19, the unforeseeable impact that it would have on the 2020 elections, the Georgia legislature enacted Senate Bill 202, which among other things made sweeping changes to the absentee ballot process, ranked choice voting for UOCAVA voters, and prevents third parties from sending voters duplicate requests for absentee ballot. There was an outcry for changes in the absentee ballot process resulting from the reported delays in voters receiving and returning their absentee ballot to county elections offices reported by eligible voters residing both in and outside of the U.S., and the growing concerns about ballot harvesting. While on the Fulton County Board of Registration and Elections, we demanded that all rejected absentee ballots and rejected provisional ballots are to be reviewed by the board prior to certification. We saw firsthand rejected ballots that were obviously written in the same handwriting. Safeguarding the absentee ballot process is vital to maintaining confidence in our elections process. Before Senate Bill 202, voters were able to request the absentee ballot up to the Friday before Election Day, which added undue pressure on county registrars to get the absentee ballots out to the voters by close of business Friday. Sadly, despite the voter outreach efforts of the county, Secretary of State, civic advocates, and nonprofit organizations around the absentee ballot process, counties still received absentee ballots after the election day, and many were even postmarked the day after the election. Senate Bill 202 provided the time needed for counties to process, mail, and ensure timely receipt of the absentee ballot by county elections offices. For the 2020 general elections, third parties mailed duplicate, even triplicate, partially completed requests for absentee ballots to Georgians. I received them myself across the state, generating multiple requests for absentee ballots to county offices, confusing voters who electronically requested their ballot or who voted early, yet they still received these mailers from third party. We needed clarification. Although many may disagree with the reduction in the runoff period from 9 to 4 weeks, there has historically been an undeniable decrease in voter participation during runoff elections. I believe that reduction in time between the election day and the runoff will positively impact voter participation. As a proud Navy mom of a son currently serving on the USS Michael Murphy, ranked choice voting is essential for military families and UOCAVA voters wanting to participate in runoff elections. The proponents of Senate Bill 202 believe that all the changes made by Senate Bill 202 are needed. The opponents of the bill will argue that the law was intended to advance a Republican agenda purposely intended to negatively impact voting on poor communities and among people of color. Opponents contend that people living in perpetual poverty may not have valid identification nor access to equipment needed to copy voter ID cards. Further, that by disallowing non-poll workers from distributing water to voters in line, this will negatively impact the voting experience for the aged and those living with physical disabilities. Senate Bill 202, like House Bill 316, was enacted by a party line vote. The challenges that I personally, and I imagine many other Americans have, is that laws passed by majority party line vote, whether Democrat or Republican, is perceived to only advance legislation that aligns with that party's priorities and policy agenda. Why is this bad for elections? Mainly because no matter who casts doubts in our electoral system, voter confidence in the electoral process decreases while voter apathy increases for everyone. When the American people are caught in the middle of political sparring between the parties, we all lose. In my experience in elections...
Ms. Neurodyne, we're going to ask you just to conclude, to summarize the remainder of your remarks.
It's just 2 more sentences. Thank you so much. I didn't realize I went over. In my experience in elections, and as a faithful steward of this process in Georgia, I have learned that whether a voter votes by punch cards, DRE machines, ballot marking devices, or paper ballots, voter confidence is directly tied to whether a candidate wins. Voter confidence will grow only with complete transparency and the enactment of elections laws reached by consensus and not by party line. I have faith that this can and will happen. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Neurodyne. Ms. Willard, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. It's a wonderful opportunity to be here with you today here in Fulton County. I've got more than 20 years experience both as a candidate. I was formerly a member of the Atlanta City Council, and I was elected citywide as president of the City Council. That would be in the bio that I submitted earlier, but I wanted to make sure that you knew that I've had to be on the same side you had in watching those returns on election night. I've been an advocate for lots of different groups for probably the last 30 years, getting people to vote. And probably most fundamental for me is I'm the daughter of a retired Air Force colonel who spent his career voting from a distance. Now I've been chair of the Fulton County Board of Registration Elections. I'm happy to be here with Dr. Ruth. And I'm glad that she gave you sort of the details about the complexities of voting in Fulton County, because we are such a large geographical area and have so many voters. It adds additional complexity. But what I think is really important is that all of us in big counties or small counties are experiencing many of the same things: dramatically increased expenses, challenges hiring staff and recruiting volunteers, and a changing landscape of equipment, software, rules, procedures, and regulations that are generally beyond our control or our input. Now, in Fulton County, we've been blessed with a really productive Board of Elections. Even though we are a bipartisan board, in almost every instance, we've spoken as one voice, and we have found ways to work with each other to identify priorities and to see that those priorities get implemented. So much so that we hired unanimously our newest Director of Elections after a nationwide search. She had a whole year to administer elections as an interim and was observed by our Performance Review Board and the Carter Center to great reviews. So when we hired her with the unanimous vote, we all had the experience and the objective observation to make sure that she was the right one for this important job. Later this month, our department's going to move to a new purpose-built central election facility that will consolidate all of our operations into a single building, and I hope with some notice maybe you'll come back and visit us there. We're very excited about that. And just last month, after a 2-year review of our elections processes, the State Election Board unanimously closed the investigation into our operations. We were happy to participate in that. I will say it was a bit time-consuming for us, but it gave us good advice about things that we could look forward to, improving our work in the future, but also validated what we already know, which is we do great work at Fulton County Board of Elections. In addition, Fulton County's audit department did a full financial audit of us last year and reported back that there were no material issues, and as well that 100% of our equipment was accounted for through our barcoded inventory system that we implemented a number of years ago. Senate Bill 202, I'll be quick, I don't have a lot of time, did a lot of things. I'm not sure all of them contributed to the outcomes that were anticipated. The most difficult thing for us were voter challenges in particular. I'm sure we'll get into that in some detail. But after about, I think, maybe 30,000 challenged voters over the course of about a year and a half, no voters were referred to the Attorney General or the Secretary of State for voting illegally. That's an important thing to say. We can talk a little bit about the costs. We can talk about the things that we're already doing, and I look forward to those questions. In terms of the Performance Review Board, which was something that came up in Senate Bill 202, I can't say enough that this was a very challenging situation. There were absolutely no parameters for what would be investigated, for how long the investigation would go, for how that would be financed, for what we would be looking for. And it could only be initiated by at least one member of the delegation, which is what happened in Fulton County. But in another county, Coffee County, where there are allegations of criminal misconduct because there's a sole member there who doesn't want a performance review, they have not experienced the same recommendations. They have not experienced the same investigation. So I hope we'll look closely at that. Restrictions on Dropbox use is a challenge for us. We appreciated getting Dropboxes. We're a big county, as Dr. Ruth mentioned, but to reduce it now to 8 for 800,000 voters has created some difficulties for us. Limitations on absentee ballot requests. I wish I could bring my 92-year-old mother here to talk to you about the complications she had, and she's got a daughter who knows about elections, but it was quite daunting. Two things that I want to not forget to talk about. One is that We don't receive federal funding, and we receive nominal state funding, and yet we get more and more requirements and regulations heaped upon us, and our taxpayers rightfully complain about the cost of elections. In 2019, our elections cost $2.50 a voter. That's now upwards of $10 a voter. That's just since 2019. We don't get additional funding for that. And then the false and fake commentary about election administration has been very difficult for all of us to do. We all want good elections. I firmly believe that, but it's also a bipartisan responsibility for us all to be truthful and honest and to look very, very clearly at rigorous and objective analysis. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll now begin questioning our witnesses. Then we'll alternate between parties. In recognition of the gentleman from the home state of Georgia, I will allow Mr. Loudermilk to begin our questions. Mr. Loudermilk.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here, panelists, and the folks who have come out to witness your government at work. Because we're doing this here, we probably have 3 times the amount of people that we would have if we were doing this hearing in Washington, D.C. And I appreciate you being here. Now, one thing I do have to comment on is my colleagues on the other side, as you heard, have complained about this being the 9th hearing we've had on this piece of legislation. I think transparency and accountability is good. I think it's something the American people expect. Had we had that to the 2 federal takeover bills, H.R. 1 in the previous 4 years that the Democrats rammed through this committee with barely even 1 hearing, you would have found out in that a whole lot more about those bills. I think the transparency and accountability is a good thing. Now, before I get into my general questions, I have learned something from my colleagues because this has been a recurring thing by my friends across the aisle at all of these hearings is the discussion about questions of who won particular elections. And I think that's a valid question to ask. So what I'd like to do is ask each of you this question, simple yes or no answer, and then I'll get into my other questions. And I'll start with you, Dr. Ruth. Did Brian Kemp win Georgia's gubernatorial election in 2018 and 2022?
Yes, he did.
Mr.
Yes,
Spakovsky. Ms. Neurodyne?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Willard?
Yes.
Thank you all. I appreciate that. That's, as you may hear, that question has been asked in another form in past hearings. But let's move on to the context of what we're here about today. And one thing I'll say, look, I appreciate y'all being here. Like many of you, I've spent many hours watching the Braves play in this building. Unlike some of you, I actually attended games that were in the building that was across the street. In fact, the first Braves game I attended at 3 years old, and I didn't even remember it. So it's good to be here doing this, and I appreciate everyone being here. Mr. von Spakovsky, good to see you again. Thank you for your continued attending these hearings in the field and in Washington, D.C. Simple question. What were some of the most important and key provisions of SB 202 in your opinion?
I think one of the most important was the extension of the state's voter ID law, which was first effective, as you know, in 2008, in that presidential election. But it only applied to in-person voting. And the state extended it to absentee balloting. They made it extremely easy for people to comply with it. Obviously, it did not in any way hurt turnout. But given the huge increase in the use of mail-in or absentee ballots, having an ID requirement for that, I think, is one of the most important changes that states can make. And as you know, other states followed Georgia's example, Texas, Florida, et cetera.
I appreciate that. It was interesting is before we started here earlier, I had a member of the media come to me and say, I've been looking over the bill. This seems like something that should be bipartisan. Why is there an argument against Senate Bill 202? What is the argument on the other side? They were honestly asking this question. So in your opinion, what is so controversial about any of the reforms that are in this bill?
Well, I don't think there should be any controversy over them. Look, the biggest complaint or criticism you always hear is that, well, if you require an ID, you're going to suppress votes. We know that's not true. And the reason we know it's not true is we now have turnout data for almost 15 years. And the turnout data overwhelmingly shows it does not suppress turnout. The National Bureau of Economic Research released a study in 2019 looking at turnout across all 50 states from 2008 to 2018 to compare states with ID to other states without ID, and said it clearly has no negative effect overall or for any group defined by age, gender, race, or party affiliation. Just this year, a new study was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, in which they took a look at this claim that has been made by some that, for example, voter ID laws benefit the Republican Party and hurt the Democratic Party because it somehow disproportionately keeps people out of the polls. They studied elections from 2003 to 2020 and looked at state-level races, governor, state legislature, congressional and presidential races. It actually slightly gave an advantage, apparently initially, to Democrats. That disappeared by 2012, according to the study, so it doesn't hurt either party. And in fact, they said the one thing they saw consistently across the board was it increased turnout because it apparently motivates and mobilizes the voters of both parties.
So people from both parties want to make sure that their votes are counted and that their votes matter, and that's why this is important. Mr. Chair, I yield back the time that I have already exceeded, and I hope we have several more hearings on this bill as we go forward because it's very important.
The gentleman yields back. The ranking member of the committee, Mr. Morelli, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to point out one thing which I think is statistically relevant, which is while November 22 turnout numbers were similar to 18, there was a dramatic difference in race. Nearly 9% higher voter turnout among white voters than non-white, and that is higher than any general election disparity in the past decade, roughly 50% higher in the previous 2 midterm elections. So we actually believe that this new law, SB 2020, has affected turnout. White voter turnout has gone up. Non-white voter turnout has gone down pretty dramatically. If black turnout was the same as white in the last election, 176,000 more black voters would have voted in Georgia. So we think it's the legislation effect is exactly what was intended, which is to reduce turnout among people of color. I want to I'll take Mr. Loudermilk's lead on this. Ms. Willard, did Joe Biden win the 2020 presidential election?
Yes, sir. I was an elector for him.
Ms. Neurodyne, did Joe Biden win the 2020 presidential election?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Van Spakovsky, did Joe Biden win the 2020 election?
Yes.
And Dr. Ruth, did Joe Biden win the 2020 presidential election?
Yes.
Thank you. I do want to one of the if I can start, Ms. Willard, one of the provisions in SB 202, that provides for unlimited voter challenges, which is interesting. Allows any Georgia voter to challenge, without any requirement of concrete, as I understand it, or particularized knowledge, the eligibility of an unlimited number of county voters, which I would assume places a significant burden on county boards of elections, because they have to then do an investigation. I think it's within 10 days. So are you able to explain the challenge process and whether or not that does present a burden to election administrators?
Yes, I'll try to do it as quickly as possible. Once we receive notification of a challenge from an individual, and that can come in any way, right? You know, letter over the transom, email, any kind of database, anything. There's no parameters in that legislation. We have 10 days to investigate the claim. We have 10 days. Within that 10 days, we need to set a hearing date, and we need to notify all the people who've been challenged. Now, if you were only getting a challenge of 1 or 2 voters, you might be able to pull that off with some rigor. But if you get a challenge list of thousands of voters, you've got to notify people to come down to a hearing to defend the challenge, regardless of whether you've had the opportunity to sort of clean through that list. We had challenges almost, gosh, it seemed like monthly in the last year. As I said, I think 30,000. I didn't have enough time when I got the invitation to verify that number, but it's at least that. Once we do that, then our staff have to go through and look at every single name and address and see what the basis of the challenge was, and then try to ascertain what was required and what to recommend to us. At that point, then we can, if we decide that there's some basis for the challenge on any individual voter, then we can tag them in our database, and they would have to correct the record when they come to vote, if they came to vote.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
That's right.
If you didn't have voter challenges, what methods would you use as election administrators to ensure integrity of the lists?
Yep, there's quite a few. We get regular monthly updates from the Department of Driver Services of address changes when people come in. There's a little asterisk to that. We get notification monthly from the Secretary of State's office from, new registrants and address changes that come in through their portal. Sometimes people come to our office or notify us in other ways that they want to change an address, or, come with a list of voter registrations that they've done as part of a voter registration drive. And then most recently, we've used our GIS team as well as an outside consultant to help us update our database in terms of commercial addresses and other things.
So you mentioned 30,000 challenges in Fulton County alone?
Yes.
To your knowledge of those 30,000 challenges, how many were successful?
Well, successful is a little bit of an ambiguous term in this regard.
How many were disqualified?
No one was referred because of criminal activity or double voting or anything like that. There were, I couldn't tell you the numbers, there were people that might have had to do updates to their addresses or things like that as a result of the challenge. And then, in terms of like the pure challenge, and we got lots and lots of feedback about errors alleged or otherwise. Dr. Ruth can recount her experience in being challenged in the aggravation of having your address pulled because you have a geographical quadrant at the end of your address, and someone thought that wasn't something that was appropriate.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Carey from the state of Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for having this field hearing, and I'd also like to thank the ranking member Morelli for having a bipartisan folks up here. It goes without saying, my first election, my first remembering of an election was 1976, and so while we are 3 days late, obviously Georgia and President Carter and Mrs. Carter celebrated their 77th wedding anniversary just 3 days ago. So I know they have some health problems, and just want to make sure we keep them all in our prayers as we go about our day. Mr. Van Spakovsky. From 2020 to 2022 elections, states have utilized something known as Zuckerbucks. Originally, they were meant to help election officials administer elections. Now, some would say they really have been used for partisan get out the vote purposes. Can you talk about some of the effects these Zuckerbucks had in the 2020 election? And do you know how it affected Georgia in any particular way?
Sure. There was about, by the way, my last name, a typical name for somebody from Alabama. There was around $450 million suddenly contributed as tax-deductible donations to a small nonprofit in the past that had a budget of $1 million. And then they suddenly started giving huge election grants to election offices. This has never occurred before in American history. And while they claim it was bipartisan, actually the money overwhelmingly went only to large urban districts that were strongholds for Democratic candidates. They would give very small amounts of money to other more rural counties, but the money overwhelmingly went there. This was a get-out-the-vote effort by moving the hard dollars, which have to be accounted for under federal campaign finance laws. And I used to enforce those laws as a member of the Federal Election Commission. Those hard dollars all have to be reported. But what the Zuckbucks did is use soft money, tax deductible, that didn't have to be reported. It went to large urban Democratic strongholds, and the intention was to use it to get out the vote. Basically moving campaigns, get out the vote operations into these local election offices.
So as a follow-up to that, many states have now banned taking Zuckerbucks. Am I correct?
Yes, and they should, because we shouldn't want any partisan political organizations, political contributors. We shouldn't want anybody. I don't care whether they're on the right side, the political aisle, or the left side, contributing money to the government officials who are supposed to be administering the election. That should not be happening.
Now, in our legislation, I believe we end this tax exemption that would be given to those organizations. Okay. Mrs. Neurodyne, in 2020, Georgia was inundated with mail-in ballots. They were received before the election day and on the election day, in some cases several days after the election. And thank you for your son's service to our country, by the way. Can you talk a little bit about your experience on the board receiving ballots after the election day had passed? And we only have a minute, so.
Can you check your microphone?
If you're asking if it occurred, yes, it did.
Well, let me ask you this. So realistically, and again, we only have about a minute, realistically speaking, when should the cutoff day be for a jurisdiction to receive a mail-in ballot?
Election day.
It should be election day. Do you think it, in any way, shape, or form, decreases voters' confidence in our election process when election boards are receiving ballots weeks after the election?
Well, unfortunately, they can't control the ballots that come in late.
Yeah.
So what's your question relating to late ballots?
Just in general. I mean, do you think that voters will view that if ballots are coming in weeks and weeks afterwards, that do you think that lessens voters' confidence in the election process?
I think if a person believed that they voted an election and didn't, it would negatively impact the confidence of all of us.
Okay. Well, I want to thank all the witnesses for coming here today, and I think you've done a very good job so far. So thanks so much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Sewell is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank everyone for being here today. I have the great honor of representing my hometown of Selma, Alabama, where John Lewis and so many amazing foot soldiers shed blood on a bridge in that hometown for the equal right of every American to vote. I think that I agree wholeheartedly that the issue of voting and election reform should be bipartisan. It shouldn't be partisan. And I am honored every day to carry the seminal piece of legislation, the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would actually restore the full enforcement of and protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You know, what I think is most distressing is that we focus on the turnout numbers. And Ms. Willard, I know that all eyes were on Georgia during the 2022 both midterm as well as the presidential election. And there were great turnouts. But as my colleague pointed out, many of those turnouts were disproportionately by white voters, not black voters. And can you talk to us a little bit about the impact of that? See, I truly believe that that it wasn't because of SB 202, but rather it was in spite of 202, African American voters came out and voted in record numbers. Can you share a little bit about what you think the impact of 202 was with respect to voter turnout and voter access?
Well, it's a big question. I think those numbers speak for themselves. You know, we've had very exciting elections in the last few years here in Georgia, and lots of attention. Lots of money has come into the state to mobilize voters. All of those things are not things I've participated in recent years. I think that some of the things that we've seen in terms of lack of access to the drop boxes created lines and congestion around our polling places.
Wasn't it true that in the areas, the counties that African Americans mostly live, Fulton, DeKalb, and Gwinnett, had a reduction of drop boxes from 37, 33, and 24 respectively to 8, 5, and 6? Doesn't that mean that African American voters have to either wait in longer lines or have a more difficult time getting to the polls.
Well, I think those numbers are correct, and I think it makes it difficult for everybody to have the opportunity to vote. I think that the changes in when people can apply for absentee ballots disproportionately impacted people who have challenges already in terms of getting those things out, not connected to the internet, maybe having some difficulty in just understanding how to process these many, many different changes that go on. And you chip away at those things little by little by little, and then it tends to add up.
I also think that the 202, SB 202, also has a election reform provision that allows the state to take over county boards of elections if they see fit. Dr. Ruth, do you think that that is a reform that should be nationalized? I think that my colleagues with their American Confidence in Elections Act is trying to really nationalize a lot of these voter suppressions. Can you give us any insight as to whether or not it's necessary for states to take over county boards of elections?
I think it's important that elections are run at the local level with guidance from the state and oversight from the state, but not takeover. We experienced that with Georgia and Fulton County, and what I appreciate from the board is we work together in a bipartisan way to ensure that in the oversight of elections, working with our department to ensure that we were in compliance. And so the performance review was very helpful for us, I would say, in ensuring that we are addressing the errors, the inconsistencies, and making sure that we're updating our systems and
Thank you. I just want to reclaim my time. I want to enter for the record a unanimous consent to enter the Brennan Center for Justice's December 2022 report, Georgia's Racial Turnout Gap Grew in 2022. Can I please?
Without objection.
In conclusion, I just want to say, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, I do believe that we should be trying to work together, Democrats and Republicans, to do election reform. I think all of us can see that there are holes and gaps in the process, but I think that in doing so, what's really also important is that we increase voter access to the ballot box, that we're not intentionally or unintentionally, inadvertently, making it harder for certain populations to vote. I think that that's why so many, we see so much polarization when it comes to that. But I want to just end by saying that I think that we would all do a lot if we could sit down at a table together and really honestly talk about election reforms. I hope that Chairwoman Lee and I can do that sometime very soon. Thanks.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Oklahoma and the chair of the Subcommittee on Modernization, Ms. Bice, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses for being here. I want to piggyback off of what my colleague, Representative Sewell, just mentioned. She's right. This should not be a partisan issue, but I think it has become that due to the lack of engagement from the Republican side during the last Congress, where I was a freshman member, as the John Lewis Voting Rights Act was pushed forward. There was no engagement from the Republican side, no even input or discussion, and that does make it difficult. So I agree with you. We should have more dialogue on this issue. I want to start with Mrs. Neurodyne. Thank you so much for your son's service and for your service to your community. I want to thank you for explaining the challenges that you face during the 2020 election honestly. And that's really why we have Senate Bill 202 and also the ACE Act being put forward. Ranking Member Morelli suggested earlier, and I think Representative Sewell as well, that there was voter suppression by race in the 2022 election due to the passage of Senate Bill 202. Would you agree with this assessment? Can you make sure to hit your, there you go.
Doing that, sorry guys.
It's okay.
I think that the struggles that impact families who are living in perpetual poverty, I think that Senate Bill 202 didn't change the reality for those voters.
Did they expand early ballot access? Was the early voting expanded with Senate Bill
So
202?
it was I think the Saturday and Sunday was added maybe, or was it there before? Well, yeah.
Okay.
So
Anyone else?
the Saturday was optional before, but now it's required for federal elections, and Sunday is optional based on superintendent.
So we've actually expanded the number of days that individuals have to vote. Dr. Ruth, do you want to comment on that at all?
No, just, I agree.
Agree, okay.
That's true.
Thank you.
Sunday is optional.
Sure. Ms. Willard, I want to follow up on Mr. Carey's line of questioning. You mentioned that you received no federal funding, very little state funding. How are you funding your operations? Are you taking any money from outside entities to help run these elections?
We've not, since I've been on the board. They might have prior to 2020, but not in the last 3 years.
So how are you funding your operations?
Local county taxpayers pay the operations fully.
Okay. You also mentioned, and I think it's important to note this, that there are geographical challenges with Fulton County. And I just thought it was an interesting sort of perspective here. So I looked it up. And you may be surprised to know that Fulton County is 534 square miles. Oklahoma County, my home county, is 718 square miles. We don't have ballot boxes at all. We have no fault absentee ballots, where you have to have an absentee ballot notarized before you send it back in. We have voter ID laws on the books, but we also can determine the night of the elections who has won. And so I'm not sure that the geographical size of the county matters. It's really how these elections are being administered that make the huge difference. And I think it's an important point to note. One of the tenets of the ACE Act is cleaning up the voter rolls. And I maybe want to ask Mr. Spakovsky, who do you think in the U.S. is doing voter maintenance well in the United States? What states are doing well?
Well, the easiest way to find out who's doing it well and who's not is to check the election integrity scorecard that the Heritage Foundation premiered in December of 2021, in which we rate every single state based on best practices.
Do you think that states like California that have decided to do mail-in balloting to everyone, and I think we've talked here, I think it even happened recently in some other states.
Well, I'll tell you, on voter
DC.
registration maintenance, California is one of the worst states in the country, so is Nevada. Some of the best states in the country are places like Texas, Georgia, Florida, but you can see our ratings. I will tell you this. We scored states based on a perfect score of 100. No state in the country scored 100. The highest state was in the low 80s. The worst states would have flunked out of college. Their scores were so low.
I think just the last point I want to make is that's why this particular piece of legislation is so important. We want to improve the process. We want to make sure that we have accurate, reliable, trustworthy elections at the end of the day, and this legislation aims to do that very thing. So thank the witnesses for being here. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Congresswoman McBath is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, Ranking Member Morelli, and all of the witnesses that are here today. We really appreciate you. And I just want to say in response to my Republican colleague, it always matters with the closing of our polling stations and the number of drop boxes that we have here in Georgia. Specifically, we saw a great number of individuals that had great difficulty in actually being able to exercise the right to vote. So yes, those things do matter. But I just want to say that I was born in Joliet, Illinois, in the heart of the civil rights movement. My father was the town's only black dentist, and my mother was a registered nurse. And they cared for people. By day, they worked to heal the sick bodies and mend the broken bones, but by night, they worked to treat the ills of a different kind. They were civil rights advocates fighting to inspire spirits that had long been battered and bruised. My father was the Illinois branch president of the NAACP, and in our household, it was expected that from the moment that we could walk, we would be marching and fighting for civil and human rights as well. We marched alongside our parents in the baking summers and the frigid winters, and I often joke and say the first song I ever learned to sing was We Shall Overcome, because we were always singing that song. And I learned that we are not to be afraid. And I also know that deep in my heart, we truly will overcome. I'm a daughter of the civil rights movement, and I'm a daughter of this country. And when you live a childhood that is dedicated to the fight for justice, the right to vote becomes sacred. It becomes your voice when there are those who seek to silence your voice. And it was in my lifetime that literacy tests and poll taxes continue to disenfranchise the descendants of slaves. And even with all the gains that we have made, it's clear that this work is far from over. Because each and every one of us has seen the lines on Election Day, particularly here in Georgia, the lines on Election Day extending around the block. Each and every one of us in the state of Georgia has seen state legislatures who have passed restrictions that make it harder for communities of color to vote. Each and every one of us, in particular here in Georgia, has seen polling places disappear in black precincts, drop boxes cut in areas with more black voters, and food and water has been banned as black voters wait in longer and longer lines. Once again, we move forward in our efforts to make it easier to vote, and we look back to find guidance from those who fought so similar a struggle, such as our beloved John Lewis. Ms. Willard, I have questions for you. The State Election Performance Review Board recently conducted an in-depth and lengthy assessment of elections administration in Fulton County. This was part of a process instituted by SB 202 that could have led to a state takeover of elections administration in Fulton County. And as I understand it, the Performance Review Board concluded that a state takeover would not be helpful. Is this correct?
That's correct.
In your opinion, was the cost in time and money of the review for Fulton County an effective use of taxpayer resources?
No, I don't think so. And I think if you were to ask the members of the Performance Review Board, they were quite frustrated as well, because they were volunteers and they were required over the course of about 2 years to spend quite a bit of their time, in addition to their service on their local election boards, to follow us around and do work. I think if one were to do something like that, I will echo Dr. Ruth's comment that taking over a board is really not to be the outcome one should look at. But if you were to do something like this, to have very, very clear guidelines about time frame, what you're investigating, why you're investigating, and what would prompt it, and it can't be politicized, where in one county an investigation gets triggered on the basis of really people's public perceptions, whereas in another county where there's criminal activity being alleged and there's no performance investigation happening.
Okay, thank you. So it seems that fighting off a partisan-inspired takeover attempt must have monopolized an incredible amount of time for Fulton County elections administrators such as yourself. Did this impact the ability of the county to perform other really vital election duties, or indirectly danger or hamper the ability of Georgia voters to have access to the ballot box?
You know, I think one of the things that I learned as being the chair of this board was that a lot of the effort that I needed to put into my work and the work of our board was to find ways to preserve time for our staff to do the work that they needed to do. The work that they don't need to do, the voter challenges, the performance review, multiple performance reviews and audits, the open records requests, the lawsuits, the subpoenas, the depositions, those are things that get in the way of us doing the complicated logistics of managing an election.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentlewoman from Florida, the current chair of the Subcommittee on Elections, the former Secretary of State of Florida, Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Von Spakovsky, I'd like to start with you today. One provision of the ACE Act that we haven't discussed yet today is the use of the existing Election Assistance Commission, a bipartisan group, to provide a forum to share best practices with states around the country, covering things such as audits, certification and testing of election systems, chain of custody, and other basics that are really essential to effective elections. Would you share with us why you believe doing that, the sharing of those best practices, is important?
Well, that's the way election officials improve. I mean, look, we have the most decentralized election system of any Western democracy. It's run, as you well know, down at the county government level. Secretaries of state oversee that, but it's really county government officials, all the folks sitting at this table. They're the ones that are doing voter registration and running the polling places. So we have literally thousands of local election officials, and sharing best practices is the best way to improve our elections. And that includes things like, look, one of the things this bill does is it makes it clear that HAVA funds can be used for post-election audits. That is vitally important. Financial and accounting audits are ubiquitous in the business world. Every business, every corporation, nonprofits have to undergo audits, and yet they are virtually non-existent in the election area. Every state needs to put in a system for comprehensive post-election audits that don't just recount ballots to make sure that the hand count agrees with machine count, but to go through the entire system and make sure that all state and federal laws were followed, individuals were able to access the polling place and vote properly, that complaints, when they were filed, were properly heard and taken care of. All of that needs to be audited, and only a handful of states have started doing that. Providing federal funding is very important for that.
And on that subject, Ms. Willard, I'd like to return to a line of questioning that you had with the ranking member Morelli, where you discussed the challenges at a local election office that you have in addressing and responding to public inquiries about voter eligibility. And I will tell you, as a former elections official, I want to acknowledge that I understand that's a real challenge. You have a finite set of resources, a finite number of employees, and certainly in Florida, we too were subject to many inquiries, many lawsuits, and things of that nature. But I'd like to hear from you how you would suggest then that we balance the needs of elections offices with those of the public, who in many cases have well-founded concerns, maybe have done their own research, identified things on the voter rolls that give them concerns. I know we all share a desire for the public to have confidence in our elections and our outcomes and in the strength of those voter rolls. So how would you suggest that a citizen, a member of the public who has concerns, can get those concerns about the eligibility of voters addressed?
Well, if you were to continue along the vein of the voter challenge law that we have right this minute, I think there should be some real guardrails about how many times any particular individual could make a challenge and how many challenges they could make and the form in which that challenge would be made. I think I would really appreciate it if the audience wouldn't speak while I'm trying to answer. It's quite distracting. So I think that, that's the fundamental problem. When we receive a list of 10,000 voters and it's 3,000 of whom had a geographical reference to their address, which everyone in the city of Atlanta has, but yet it triggers us having to respond in 10 days, it's quite distracting.
But in the event that, because of course some groups and some individuals are much more dedicated to this than others, and so there will be some groups and some individuals who have a higher number of these challenges. And I think one of our obligations as elections officials is to find a way to be sure that we're responsive to the public. And so where they have concerns, whether it's one concern or 1,000 concerns, that we're finding a way efficiently as elections officials to hear them and address those concerns. So, one of the questions I know that has been discussed is, should that be at the state level as opposed to the local election? But I don't think we can take the position that we're simply not going to respond, or that we're not going to respond because the requests are too numerous. Dr. Ruth, let me ask you the same question. What are your thoughts on how we can be communicating back with the public who have concerns about the integrity of our rolls, that election officials are hearing them and addressing those concerns?
And so I think there are two things, and I think Hans touched on one, and that is best practices. And so one of the things is really understanding how are other states dealing with challenges. New Hampshire has that law in particularly. And also the spirit of the law. I think it's also important for the the department to put into place a criteria for hearing challenges that can be posted on the website so that persons who are submitting challenges, that they understand what the criteria is. It is up to the person submitting the challenge to provide the preponderance of evidence.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Marjorie Taylor Greene, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for letting me sit in on the committee today and participate. I thank our witnesses and everyone here that's come to the committee hearing. Elections have consequences, and certainly we are living through the consequences. We have wide open borders with over 5.3 million people who have attempted to come into our country. Fentanyl is now the #1 cause of death of young people from ages 18 to 45. We also have the very unfortunate circumstance of possibly moving towards World War III with the escalation of the war in Ukraine and the United States backing it. And then something I care a lot about is our kids. Unfortunately, there is a trans ideology that is coming after our children, and I think that's something. So elections have consequences, and the 2020 election had consequences. And according to polling as recent as June 2023, only 32% of all voters, Republican, Democrat, Independent, believe that there was no cheating in 2020. So this is a very important hearing, and this is an important bill that is being presented before you. And in coming up on the 2024 election, 54% of all voters expect voter fraud. So I'm very glad to be participating. For my role in the ACE Act, I've introduced the District of Columbia Voter Identification Act, which will be an important piece of this package, hopefully to be brought forward as a model for all states. This requires voter ID, and the reason why we introduced this is because in the District of Columbia, they wanted to let anyone vote, foreigners, illegals, anyone that lived in the District of Columbia, including foreign nationals, diplomats, and that shouldn't be happening. So there will be no illegal aliens voting, and I think that's important. And also, it requires ID, and ID is important. It requires driver's licenses, a passport, military photo ID, student ID, or the last 4 digits of the voter's social security number. This is an important issue because ID is required not only for many things like buying alcohol if you're 21 years of age, but also to receive SNAP benefits, which many poor people unfortunately do have to receive. They also have to prove identity, ID, like a social security number. I don't think ID is a race issue. ID is part of being a U.S. citizen, and it should be a requirement to vote. And this is something that should be required for everyone. So I don't think there should be any partiality or be considered racist. So I'd like to ask our panel here, Dr. Ruth, do you consider IDs to be racist?
I do not.
Okay. Mr. Spakovsky?
I do not. And I do not, and the evidence shows they're not.
Okay. Ms. Neurodyne?
Microphone.
I believe ID is important. I agree, definitely. However, there must be a reasonable remedy for people who are challenged in this way. What I fear is that someone who's eligible to vote who may not have ID can't. And so, no, I don't want non-citizens.
But it's not racist as long as everyone's able to get an ID. Thank you, Ms. Neurodyne. Ms. Woodward, I'm sorry, Ms.
Willard. It's Willard. By definition, IDs can't be racist, but I do think that the lack of IDs in a county like Fulton County, where we have the highest level of income inequality in the country, presents certain challenges for people.
Ms. Willard, it could only be racist if we're identifying someone's skin color, not their citizenship in the country. Thank you for answering my question. Now, another thing to talk about for the state of Georgia is the fact that my former husband was told when he went to vote in 2020 that he had already voted by absentee ballot. He never requested an absentee ballot form. He never turned in an absentee ballot to vote, and he wanted to vote in person. He was forced to sign an affidavit at that time, surrendering a ballot he never voted on in order to vote in person in the 2020 election. He was called a liar. I was called a liar. He hired an attorney, did a FOIA request, and it proved after the FOIA and all the work was done, there was never an absentee ballot turned in his name, never a request form with an envelope turned in his name. But the Secretary of State said that he voted by absentee ballot. And the Secretary of State has never answered our question on why that's happened. So I just wanted to state that for the record today. There's definitely problems in elections. SB 202 has done a great job in turnout, giving a 57% higher than national midterm average of 52%. But there definitely is a cause, and this is why people are here, and they care about our elections. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentlewoman yields back. Mr. Collins from the state of Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I couldn't help but to notice you mentioned the Braves, but as being a good citizen of the 10th District, we have the Georgia Bulldogs that are back-to-back.
Bulldogs.
Maybe a three-peat, and you can mention that when you come back in the fall. Wait a minute now. I've got time going here. Folks, this is my first time being elected. I'm a freshman in Congress, but I've spent many years in county politics as a county chairman. So I've worked those polls, and I had to work them personally because I know how hard it was to get people to show up to work the polls. And that was the case. Now, it's not anymore, but that was the case. And I want to focus on a couple of things that I don't think we've touched on too much today. And Mrs. Spakovsky, I'd like to focus on cleaning up our voter rolls. And I don't know how much your knowledge of the Electronic Registration Information Center is, but that's kind of what I want to hit on right now, because at least 7 states have pulled out of this electronic registration to so-called improve our voter rolls. Do you see any concerns with ERIC?
Yes. In fact, I published a paper some months ago pointing out many of the problems with ERIC. I mean, just to give you one quick example, the whole purpose of ERIC is, excuse me, for states to share their statewide computer lists to find, for example, people who are registered in more than one state, for example, perhaps Georgia and Florida. But as we talked about before, excuse me, being a citizen is a requirement, and yet the ERIC membership agreement bars states when they're providing their statewide voter list and their DMV lists, which are also used to check this information, from providing any information that indicates the citizenship status of an individual, for example, who's got a driver's license. Why would you bar that information? That's relevant to whether someone should be registered or not. I understand why those states have pulled out. I believe they're working on an alternative, trying to set up an alternative that won't have some of these problems that ERIC has, and I encourage them to do that.
Has the founder of ERIC previously shared information with outside resources?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Has the founder of ERIC, David Becker, has he been known to share information with outside election organizations?
Well, in fact, that's another issue that the withdrawing states haven't been able to get a clear answer to, and that is whether their confidential voter registration information has been shared with third parties, particularly third parties that might be using it for partisan purposes.
Would you agree with me that the highlight that's been put on voting today, it would be better to be decentralized and let local people like they used to go back and start cleaning up our voter rolls?
I think states, there are many, many things states can do to clean up their voter rolls. The one thing that they can't do on their own is the state of Georgia doesn't have the ability to get information on its own of who might be registered in both Georgia and Florida without the cooperation of Florida. So some kind of agreement needs to be there for the sharing of data. There used to be a second program that did that. It was called the Kansas Interstate Crosscheck Program, but it was driven out of business by lawsuits filed by the ACLU and others who didn't want a rival to Eric.
And that happens a lot, not just in that, but in the next thing that I want to talk to, and thank you, I'm running short. Ms. Neurodyne, tell your son thank you for his service, first of all. Dominion machines. Georgia's got more than any other state in the union, I believe. Probably about 10,000. Is it cheaper to use Dominion machines or paper ballots?
Microphone.
I would have to say it's probably 10 times more expensive to use those Dominion machines. As a small county, they only had one polling precinct until Mr. Spakovsky clearly hit the nail on the head and we got sued and we had to open up more polling places and we didn't get any more extra voters in the 2022 election than we did 2020. We had to go out and spend extra money on all those new Dominion machines, which now has not been updated, and there's clearly a cyber security threat with those machines because there is a patch that they want you to implement and nobody wants to update them in Georgia.
To answer your question, if I may, sir.
You can, the witness can comment.
Yes, thank you. Fulton has over 830,000 registered voters, and I think that there would be a challenge conducting a paper ballot election for Fulton in particular. You know, as far as the cost of it, I don't know, but I will say that comparing Fulton to a county with 10,000 people is just not fair.
We've got 28,000.
28,000.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman. I got a lot more questions, but I'll yield back.
The gentleman's time's expired. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purpose of asking our witnesses questions. I will note that after the passage of SB 202, apparently Georgia's won a World Series with the Atlanta Braves, and the University of Georgia won 2 national football championships. So I can't believe that there's any state in the country that's not trying to pass voter integrity legislation. I say that as a firm believer in the University of Wisconsin and a Brewers fan. But in a serious sense, as we look at the impact that SB 202 had here in Georgia, as we think about the American Confidence in Elections Act, the ACE Act that we've introduced today, I want to go back, if I can, Dr. Ruth, with you, and look back at a University of Georgia survey that they did after the election. In particular, it asked people about whether or not they faced voting problems. In particular, we had a lot of conversation about underrepresented minority groups and some of the challenges that they may face. In that survey, do you know what it said as it related to African Americans who faced, quote, no voting problems?
Just to give a little background, that the UGA survey, the UGA surveyed 1,253 registered voters. 64% voted early, 30 voted on election day. And it is true that 0% of African Americans responded that they had a poor voting experience.
That's a pretty positive thing after we were told that SB 202 was Jim Crow 2.0 by the President of the United States. Following analysis of that data and your knowledge of the Georgia election law, do you believe that SB 202 was truly Jim Crow 2.0?
I do not.
You do not. I think that's really important because it's easy to have false narratives thrown at election integrity legislation like the ACE Act. But when we examine the underlying empirical data, often we're finding that those narratives are false and are simply trying to scare people from passing strong voter integrity provisions that at the end of the day increase voter turnout. And so if I can jump to you, Ms. Neurodyne, as we look at the turnout in the 2022 election, was the turnout rate in Georgia higher than the national average?
I believe it was.
Yeah, it was 57%. The national average was 52%. So following Georgia passing an election integrity bill and implementing that bill, Georgia's voting at a higher rate than the national average. To me, giving further evidence that passing election integrity election integrity actually enhances individuals' confidence in their elections, and as a result, more people are participating in the process as they have confidence in the elections. If I can go back to you, Dr. Ruth, on something we talked about as related to ballot drop boxes. In Georgia before COVID, so go back to 2018 and before, were ballot boxes legal in the state of Georgia?
No, they were not.
They were not. And then following the passage of SB 202, ballot drop boxes are now legal. There's rules and regulations around them, but they're now legal in the state of Georgia. Is that accurate?
They are.
So it'd be fair to say that SB 202 actually increased the use of ballot drop boxes in the state of Georgia, did not decrease them in the state of Georgia.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, I think that's pretty important. And then if I can come to you, Mr. Van Spakovsky, looking at President Biden's executive order, it's 14019, because I know you're a numbers guy and in the details, quote, promoting voting access, end quote. It requires federal agencies to do a lot of things, but it does a lot of stuff that really is partisan election work. Do you have concerns that federal agencies would be using federal taxpayer dollars to engage in partisan elections?
Yes, and the problem with that executive order was that the president had no constitutional or statutory authority to start directing federal agencies to not only engage in voter registration activities, but also was telling them to help voters obtain and vote their absentee ballots. I mean, that's outlined in the executive order. And this is so potentially confusing to voters and to state election officials that a number of secretaries of state protested this, saying you are going to confuse our voters. And just one other thing on this, Mr. Chairman, I think is very important. Individuals who are members of the public who are applying, for example, for benefits, vulnerable members of the public, veterans benefits, Social Security disability benefits, and suddenly the federal clerk they're dealing with says, oh, by the way, you need to get registered to vote. Oh, and can I help you with your absentee ballot? What are those vulnerable members of the public to think? Boy, I better do this. I better vote for the...
You and I, Mr. Spakovsky, share the same concerns on this, that when you allow the federal government to use federal taxpayer dollars for election partisan purposes, there's a whole host of concerns. Let me come back to one final point that I think is really important. Our bill prevents that, might I add. But as we look at funds coming into elections under the guise of charitable entities, 501c3, 501c4s, the risk in particular of Zuckerbucks or of nonprofit entities getting involved in electioneering, I have grave concerns with. Another thing that I have real serious concerns with is foreign money coming into U.S. elections with the loophole of charitable entities. Does this bill clear up both the loophole which currently would allow Zuckerbucks to come through and obtain a tax-free advantage? This closes that, correct?
It closes it, and this is a needed change in federal law.
And then the second one that it closes is prevents a foreign actor, a foreign person, a non-citizen, from putting money into a U.S.-based charity, which would then be transferred to a super PAC to then do the bidding of a foreign actor. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that is accurate, and again, that is a needed change.
I think at a minimum, those are two things that my colleagues across the aisle should be supportive of. I think those are absolutely critical reforms. I'm going to now yield back to myself before we close this hearing. Just want to say thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. Thank you to our audience. I think on the whole, we kept it in check as we were going through a pretty important topic. But I also want to give a big thank you to the staff and the students at Georgia State University. We just can't thank you enough for your hospitality today. I now recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree. I want to add my thanks to Georgia State and their beautiful facility here. And thank you to everyone who participated in trying to make this civil. We obviously have disagreements. But I come from Rochester, New York, which was the home of Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony. The right to vote is our birthright as Americans, and we have to do everything we can to ensure that every American has the opportunity to vote. And I look forward to a bipartisanship coming together that we can eliminate the disparity between black voters and white voters and throughout American elections. Before I conclude, Mr. Chairman, I would like to seek unanimous consent the following be added to the record. First, a series of articles by Mark Neese, published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. There are several of them, and and the following expert reports filed in the consolidated lawsuits against SB 202, which demonstrate the law's discriminatory and unlawful impact on individuals of color. Expert reports by Dr. Carol Anderson, Dr. Bernard Fraga, Dr. Stephen Pettigrew, and Dr. Barry Burden. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to add those to the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, sir.
For what purposes, the gentleman seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also would like to submit something for the record. It was mentioned earlier today, as well as in this hearing, a Brennan study that made the claim that total turnout between 2022 and 2018 had decreased. I would like to submit for the record the actual Georgia Secretary of State's data that shows that voter turnout actually did increase between 2018 and 2022. However, white voter participation between 2018 and 2022 actually decreased. Non-white voter participation significantly increased between 2018 and 2022, and that is raw data from the Georgia Secretary of State's office.
Without objection, so ordered. Again, I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here, Georgia State University for hosting us today. Members of the committee may have additional questions for you. We'd ask that you please respond to those questions in writing. Without objection, each member will have 5 legislative days to insert additional materials into the record or to revise and extend their remarks. If there's no further business, I thank the members for their participation. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
Wait, but we're sitting. How can